62,979,766 people. That's how many Americans were counted in the 1890 census. Nearly 15% of them were foreign-born, one of the highest percentages in the nation's history. And almost all of those records are gone. Not lost, gone, deliberately destroyed. The official story is simple. A fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Department building on January 10, 1921. Flames consumed roughly a quarter of the records. Water and smoke damaged half of what remained. Tragedy, yes. But accidents happen. Except that's not what actually destroyed the 1890 census. The fire was just the beginning. Here's what they don't mention in the textbooks. 12 years after that fire, after the damaged records had been sitting in a warehouse deteriorating, untouched, unrestored, the chief clerk of the Bureau of Census sent a letter to the Librarian of Congress. The letter contained a list of documents scheduled for destruction. The 1890 census was on that list. Congress authorized the destruction on February 21, 1933. The very next day, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building. The fireproof, climate-controlled facility specifically designed to preserve exactly these kinds of irreplaceable historical documents. They destroyed the records one day before breaking ground on the building that would have saved them. Of 62 million names, roughly 6,000 survive today. Now, let me tell you who those 62 million people were, because that context changes everything. The 1890 census captured America at a moment of unprecedented demographic transformation. Between 1870 and 1900, nearly 12 million immigrants flooded into the United States. They came from everywhere: Italy, Russia, Poland, China. They fled crop failures, political persecution, religious violence, economic collapse. They arrived speaking dozens of languages. They brought customs, religions, and traditions that looked nothing like what most Americans considered normal. By 1890, in most large northern cities, immigrants and their children made up 60% of the population. In some neighborhoods, that number hit 80 or 90%. In New York, over 80% of the population was either foreign-born or the children of foreign-born parents. America wasn't just changing. It was being rebuilt from the inside out by people who weren't supposed to be there. And the country was furious about it. In 1887, an organization called the American Protective Association formed in Iowa. Within 8 years, it had 500,000 members. Their mission was explicit: stop immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Catholics, Jews, Slavs. People they openly called the refuse of Europe. People they insisted could never be assimilated, never be American, never belong. A best-selling book published in 1885 by Reverend Josiah Strong laid out the threat in stark terms. He used census data to argue that immigrants from certain countries were destroying the moral fabric of America. When the 1890 census results came in, he published a revised edition. The new data proved his point even more dramatically. These people were everywhere now, and they were multiplying. This wasn't fringe thinking. This was mainstream American opinion in the 1890s. The Chinese Exclusion Act had already passed in 1882, virtually ending Chinese immigration for nearly a century. Catholic churches were being vandalized and burned. Italian immigrants were lynched, more than 20 in the 1890s alone. In 1891, one of the bloodiest episodes took place in New Orleans. A mob stormed the parish prison and murdered 11 Italian men who'd been acquitted of killing the police chief. No one was prosecuted. The country was fragmenting along lines of origin, language, religion, race, and the 1890 census documented all of it in unprecedented detail. For the first time, each family received its own census form. Questions appeared about home ownership, farm ownership, English language proficiency, immigration status, naturalization details. Civil War veterans were identified. Questions about a woman's childbearing history appeared for the first time. Race was reported in far more detail than ever before. This wasn't just a head count. This was a comprehensive snapshot of who lived in America, where they came from, whether they owned property, whether they spoke English, whether they'd become citizens. It was a map of the entire social structure at the exact moment that structure was being challenged by millions of newcomers, and it's almost entirely gone. You need to understand something about how census records were stored. From 1790 through 1880, every single census had local backups. Copies were filed in county courthouses and state archives. Redundancy was standard protocol. If the federal copy was lost, local copies survived. The 1890 census broke that pattern. For the first time in a century of American census taking, there were no local backups. Every record existed in exactly one location: the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington. When that fire broke out on January 10, 1921, 5 people died: a reporter, an engineer, 3 others whose names were never recorded. The flames were so intense it took over 4 hours to extinguish them. The cause was never determined. Census Director Sam Rogers initially believed most of the records would survive. They'd been stored on pine shelves just outside an archival vault, first in the path of the firemen, but protected enough that water damage might be repairable. He was wrong. The fragile paper continued deteriorating in moldering piles for months after the fire. No restoration effort began. No emergency measures were taken. The records sat in their damaged state, slowly disintegrating, while bureaucrats debated what to do with them. The National Genealogical Society erupted in protest when rumors of destruction surfaced. They passed resolutions. They petitioned Congress. They begged the Secretary of Commerce to preserve what remained. Roughly 6/7 of the enumeration district records had survived in some form. Damaged, yes, but potentially salvageable. Congress denied they had any plans to destroy the records. Then, in December 1932, the destruction order went out anyway. The chief clerk of the Bureau of Census sent the Librarian of Congress a list of papers scheduled for destruction. The damaged 1890 census schedules were on that list. The librarian was asked to identify any records worth preserving for historical purposes. He identified none. On February 21, 1933, Congress authorized the destruction. The next day, February 22nd, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, the fireproof facility specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of loss. They destroyed the records one day before beginning construction of the building that would have saved them. By 1934 or 1935, the surviving fragments were gone. Of 62,979,766 names, approximately 6,160 remain. The most comprehensive documentation of Americans alive during the greatest demographic upheaval in the nation's history, eliminated through fire, neglect, bureaucratic process, and authorized destruction. Let me be clear about what this means. If your ancestors were living in America in 1890, their detailed records are almost certainly gone. Where they lived, whether they owned property, whether they spoke English, whether they'd naturalized, how many children were born, how many had died, all of it documented for the first and only time with that level of specificity, and then erased. The 1900 census exists. The 1880 census exists, but the census that captured the exact moment when America transformed from one thing into another is a void. Here's what survived. A handful of fragments from Alabama, the District of Columbia, Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, South Dakota, and Texas. Pieces, scraps, not even complete enumeration districts, just whatever happened to be salvageable after decades of water damage and bureaucratic indifference. The National Archives maintains these fragments now. You can view them online. They're heartbreaking in their incompleteness. A few pages from Perry County, Ohio, part of Eastchester, New York. Fragments of Wright County, Minnesota. Each page a reminder of what once existed in totality and now exists only as evidence of absence. The timing forces questions that don't have comfortable answers. The 1926 Public Buildings Act authorized construction of the National Archives. Congress knew the problem existed. They'd lost critical documents to fire, flood, and administrative chaos for over a century. The solution was being built. And in the narrow window between authorization and completion, between recognizing the problem and solving it, the 1890 census was deliberately destroyed. Not lost, destroyed by order, with full knowledge of what was being eliminated. You might argue this was simple bureaucratic incompetence, clerks making bad decisions, budget constraints, storage limitations. The simplest explanation is often correct, except the sequence doesn't support simplicity. The fire happened in 1921. The destruction order came in 1933. 12 years. 12 years during which restoration technology improved, during which archival science advanced, during which the National Archives project moved from concept to cornerstone, and instead of preservation, elimination. The social context makes this worse. The 1890 census documented America at peak xenophobia. The American Protective Association had 500,000 members by 1895. Anti-immigrant violence was escalating. Reverend Josiah Strong's book identifying Southern and Eastern Europeans as threats to American civilization was a bestseller. The Chinese Exclusion Act had already passed. Italian immigrants were being lynched. Catholic churches burned. The country was fracturing along ethnic lines, and the 1890 census held the most detailed map of those fracture points ever created. Who lived where? Who owned what? Who spoke English and who didn't? Who'd naturalized and who remained foreign? Every data point that could be used to track, categorize, and target immigrant populations was recorded with unprecedented precision. And then it was gone. I'm not suggesting conspiracy. I'm noting pattern. The same pattern that appears across this entire investigation. Documents that would prove or disprove alternative histories of American development consistently disappear at critical junctures. The 1871 fires destroyed cities across 3 states simultaneously. The orphan trains severed identity records for 250,000 children. The World's Fair buildings were demolished immediately after display. The tally stick records were burned, taking Parliament with them. And the 1890 census, the one record that could definitively document every American alive during the transition period, was eliminated through a cascade of failures so perfectly timed they strain credibility. The Federal Writers' Project tried to recover what was lost. Between 1936 and 1940, government writers fanned out across 24 states interviewing elderly Americans before their memories disappeared. They collected 2,900 life histories, a fraction of what existed, a fraction of what should have been preserved in the census itself. Those interviews captured voices of people born in the 1850s and 1860s, people who lived through whatever happened in 1871, people who watched the architecture change and the cities rebuild, and the official history solidify around them. But 2,900 testimonies cannot replace 62 million detailed records. The Oral History Project was canceled in 1939. The census records were destroyed by 1935. Both attempts to document the transition were cut short before completion. The evidence isn't hidden, it's cataloged. The surviving 1890 census fragments sit in the National Archives, available for anyone to examine. The Federal Writers Project interviews are in the Library of Congress, searchable and readable. The architectural records exist. The newspaper accounts of the 1871 fires are preserved on microfilm. None of this is secret. It's simply incomplete, fragmented, just coherent enough to suggest what's missing, just damaged enough to prevent definitive conclusions. And maybe that's the point. Not to hide everything, but to ensure nothing can be fully proven. To create a historical record so compromised that official narratives can't be challenged with documentary evidence because the documents don't exist anymore. The last Americans who remembered the old world died decades ago. Their grandchildren are disappearing now. And the records that would have preserved what they witnessed were destroyed one day before the building meant to protect them broke ground. The pattern exists whether we acknowledge it or not. 62 million names erased. The most detailed snapshot of America's transformation reduced to 6,000 fragments. One day before the National Archives' cornerstone was laid. That timing asks questions history hasn't answered.